What if I told you that the biggest financial countdown in America isn't happening on Wall Street? It's happening in plain sight, and almost nobody is paying attention. Every single second, America's national debt keeps climbing higher. Most people hear the number, shake their heads, and move on. But according to Ray Dalio's long-term economic framework, there comes a moment in every debt cycle when the numbers stop being just numbers. They become a warning that the system is approaching a point where confidence begins to crack. And once confidence starts disappearing, history shows that markets, currencies, and even entire economies can change much faster than anyone expects. Ray Dalio has spent decades studying the rise and fall of global powers, and he believes excessive debt has been one of the biggest reasons why great nations eventually lose their financial dominance. The scary part is that this isn't just about government budgets. It affects your retirement account, your savings, your investments, and even the purchasing power of every dollar in your wallet. So the question isn't whether America's debt is growing. The real question is this: has the debt clock already reached the point of no return? And if it has, what happens next? For years, America has relied on borrowing to fuel economic growth. During recessions, crises, and even periods of expansion, the government continued issuing more debt to finance spending. This strategy worked because investors around the world trusted the United States more than any other economy. U.S. Treasury bonds became the world's safest asset, and countries, banks, and institutions were willing to lend America money at relatively low interest rates. But Ray Dalio argues that this system only works as long as confidence remains strong. Once debt grows faster than income for too long, lenders begin asking difficult questions. Can the borrower continue paying interest? Will inflation reduce the value of our payments? And most importantly, who will keep buying more debt? Today, America's debt has reached levels that would have seemed impossible only a generation ago. Every year the government spends more than it collects in taxes, forcing it to borrow even more. At the same time, interest payments themselves are becoming one of the largest expenses in the federal budget. This creates what Dalio often describes as a self-reinforcing cycle. More debt leads to higher interest costs. Higher interest costs require even more borrowing. That borrowing increases total debt again, making future interest payments even larger. Over time, the cycle becomes increasingly difficult to slow down. Ray Dalio often compares national debt cycles to personal finances. Imagine a family that keeps using credit cards to pay off older credit cards. At first, everything looks manageable because bills are still being paid, but eventually interest payments consume such a large portion of income that even small financial shocks become dangerous. Nations operate on a much larger scale, but the underlying principle remains surprisingly similar. Borrowing can solve short-term problems, but excessive borrowing eventually creates long-term risks that cannot be ignored forever. Another concern Dalio raises involves the buyers of U.S. debt. For decades, foreign governments eagerly purchased Treasury securities because they trusted America's financial system and wanted safe reserves. However, in recent years, several countries have reduced the pace of Treasury purchases while increasing their gold holdings instead. That doesn't necessarily mean a collapse is imminent, but it does suggest that global diversification is taking place. If demand for U.S. debt weakens while borrowing continues rising, interest rates may have to stay higher to attract investors. Higher rates increase borrowing costs for businesses, homeowners, and consumers throughout the economy. This is where the debt clock becomes more than just an enormous number. Every additional $1 trillion borrowed increases future obligations. If economic growth slows while debt continues accelerating, policymakers face increasingly difficult choices. They can reduce spending, raise taxes, borrow even more, or allow central banks to create additional money. None of these options is painless, and each carries significant economic consequences. Dalio believes history repeatedly shows that governments often choose the politically easier path of creating more money rather than making and popular fiscal adjustments. Printing more money may temporarily reduce financial pressure, but it often creates another challenge: inflation. When more money enters the system without corresponding increases in productivity, purchasing power can gradually decline. That means consumers may need more dollars to buy the same goods and services. Even if wages rise, they may not keep pace with the increasing cost of living. This silent erosion of purchasing power is one of the reasons Dalio frequently encourages investors to think carefully about protecting wealth over long periods rather than focusing only on short-term market movements. Importantly, Ray Dalio does not claim that America is about to disappear or that financial collapse is guaranteed. His message is more nuanced. He believes large debt burdens reduce flexibility during future recessions. Governments already carrying enormous debt may have fewer effective policy options than they had in previous decades. The higher the debt burden becomes, the more sensitive the economy becomes to interest rates, investor confidence, and global capital flows. For ordinary Americans, these issues may seem distant, but they eventually affect daily life. Mortgage rates, credit card interest, business investment, retirement portfolios, stock valuations, and even job opportunities can all be influenced by government borrowing costs and monetary policy. That's why Dalio repeatedly emphasizes understanding the big cycle rather than reacting emotionally to daily headlines. Long-term investors who recognize structural trends may be better prepared for changing market environments. Dalio also reminds people that every major economic transition creates both risks and opportunities. History shows that innovation, productivity, and well-managed businesses continue creating value even during challenging periods. Diversification, disciplined investing, maintaining cash reserves, and avoiding excessive leverage become increasingly important when uncertainty rises. Instead of trying to predict the exact timing of economic events, successful investors focus on building resilience so they can withstand multiple possible outcomes. The debt clock itself is not a magical countdown to disaster. It is a symbol of a broader challenge that has been building for decades. The real issue isn't the exact number displayed today. It's whether debt continues growing faster than the economy's ability to support it over the long run. According to Ray Dalio's framework, that balance ultimately determines whether confidence remains intact or begins to weaken. As investors and citizens, we cannot control government policy, interest rates, or global capital flows, but we can control how prepared we are. Understanding economic cycles, avoiding emotional decisions, maintaining diversified portfolios, and focusing on long-term financial health may become increasingly valuable in the years ahead. So perhaps the most important question isn't whether America's debt clock has reached the point of no return. The more important question is whether individuals are prepared for a world where debt, inflation, and changing financial conditions become permanent realities rather than temporary headlines. Because if Ray Dalio's decades of studying history have taught us anything, it's that the biggest financial changes rarely happen overnight. They build quietly for years, until suddenly everyone realizes the world has already changed.